1968, the year the world protest France, Czechoslovakia, the US, and Mexico, global unrest in 1 year. Welcome to today's episode. We're taking you back to a single, electrifying year, 1968, when the world erupted in protest. From student uprisings in Paris to tanks in Prague, from the streets of Chicago to the massacre in Mexico City, people across continents were rising up, against war, authoritarianism, racism, inequality, and repression. In capitals, on campuses, in factories, and in city squares, millions demanded change. So, what made 1968 such a combustible year? Why did unrest break out almost simultaneously across such different countries? And what were the lasting effects of this global explosion of dissent? Let's travel through a year when the status quo cracked, and the world's youth tried to remake the future. France, May 68, and the student worker revolt. It started with students. In May 1968, university protests in France escalated into a nationwide crisis. Students occupied campuses and clashed with riot police over authoritarian education systems, capitalism, and colonialism. But something remarkable happened: workers joined them. Soon, 10 million people went on strike. Factories shut down. Transportation stopped. For a brief moment, it looked like a revolution was unfolding in one of Europe's most developed democracies. President Charles de Gaulle fled the country briefly, fearing collapse. Though the movement didn't overthrow the system, it shook French politics and culture to the core. It changed how people thought about power, work, gender roles, and personal freedom. Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring, and Soviet tanks. Meanwhile, in the east, hope bloomed, and was crushed. In Czechoslovakia, Communist Party leader Alexander Dubček promised a new vision of socialism. Socialism with a human face. During the Prague Spring, censorship was lifted, political debate flourished, and reforms gave people real optimism for a more open society. But the Soviet Union saw this as a threat to its control over Eastern Europe. In August 1968, Warsaw Pact troops invaded. Tanks rolled through Prague, and the reforms were violently reversed. The message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated behind the Iron Curtain. Still, the spirit of Prague Spring lived on. It showed that even under dictatorship, people would fight for freedom of thought, speech, and choice, whatever the cost. United States, civil rights, Vietnam, and the politics of rage in the United States, 1968 was a year of trauma and defiance. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April. Robert F. Kennedy was killed in June. Cities burned in grief and rage. The Vietnam War dragged on, with rising casualties and mounting protests. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, peaceful anti-war demonstrators were beaten live on television by police. It felt like America was tearing itself apart. And yet, people kept marching. Black activists, anti-war protesters, Chicano organizers, feminists, and LGBTQ+ groups were all mobilizing. They were demanding an end to racism, militarism, and inequality, and challenging the foundations of American power. 1968 didn't offer easy answers. But it forced a reckoning with what kind of country the US claimed to be, and who it was leaving behind. Mexico, the Tlatelolco Massacre and state violence south of the border. In Mexico City, thousands of students took to the streets demanding democracy, education reform, and an end to government repression. The protests gained momentum ahead of the 1968 Summer Olympics, which Mexico was hosting, the first Latin American nation ever to do so. The government was determined to maintain order and its international image. On October 2, 1968, just days before the Olympics, the Mexican military opened fire on a peaceful student protest at the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in Tlatelolco. Hundreds were killed. The truth was covered up for decades. But the massacre exposed the brutality of the regime, and for generations of Mexicans, it became a symbol of resistance and memory, proof that the struggle for justice can come at a terrible cost. A global pattern: youth, hope, and suppression. From Paris to Prague, from Chicago to Tlatelolco, 1968 revealed common threads: young people were at the forefront, impatient with old systems, demanding new voices. Many were driven by anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, or anti-authoritarian ideals. They used new tools, mass media, underground newspapers, guerrilla theater, and televised protest. Governments responded with a mix of concession and crackdowns. Absolutely, here's an expanded and polished version of your powerful closing, adding historical texture, emotional depth, and cultural reflection while staying true to your original tone and message. In many places, the uprisings of 1968 didn't bring immediate success. Reforms were rolled back. Leaders were jailed. Movements were silenced. But the ideas didn't die, they transformed. 1968 didn't start a global revolution, but it redefined what was possible. It reshaped political imagination in the US, it energized movements for civil rights, Chicano rights, indigenous sovereignty, and gender equality. In France and Germany, it cracked open debates about democracy, consumerism, and post-war memory. In Eastern Europe, it planted seeds of dissent that would grow into the collapse of Soviet domination. By the 1980s. It shaped a generation, and the generations after. The second wave feminist movement gained momentum, challenging patriarchy in law, media, and everyday life. The gay liberation movement emerged from the shadows, demanding visibility, dignity, and justice. Youth worldwide began imagining democracy not just as voting, but as active, radical participation in every part of life. It wasn't just political. 1968 was a cultural rupture, a transformation in how people dressed, created, and related. In music, artists like Nina Simone, Bob Dylan, the Beatles, and Victor Jara gave voice to the struggle. In art and film, boundaries blurred, and protest became performance. Fashion rejected conformity. Education was challenged. Authority no longer went unquestioned. It inspired new kinds of activism that would echo through the decades, from anti-apartheid movements to truth and reconciliation efforts. From Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matter, from climate strikes to student-led movements for gun control, education rights, and global justice. It was a year of unfinished dreams, of revolutions that didn't win, but also didn't lose. A year when the youth of the world stood up and declared, "We have a voice. We have a future. And we refuse to be silent." 1968 wasn't just a chapter in history, it was a worldwide shout for change. It was a moment when young people, workers, students, and citizens across the globe rose up to say,